World War II did not break out by chance. It emerged with ferocious speed, driven by the unstoppable ambition of Adolf Hitler. From the moment he came to power, he already had in mind an urgent expansion, a war that he considered inevitable and necessary to fulfill his vision of the world. His ideology, his obsession with conquest, and his contempt for diplomacy pushed Europe into conflict before anyone could stop it. Understanding that mind is understanding why the war started so quickly and how a single leader was able to drag the entire planet into disaster. The construction of radical thought, ideology, hate, and ambition. The construction of Adolf Hitler's radical thought was not the result of a sudden idea or a single isolated event. It was the sum of personal experiences, readings, cultural currents, and a political context that acted as catalysts. To understand this intellectual and emotional development, it is necessary to follow several simultaneous lines: Hitler's personal biography, the speeches and works he read and quoted, the political and cultural circles he frequented, and the historical conditions that made his message fertile. Hitler came to politics with a unique mix of social resentment and personal ambition. His childhood and youth were marked by frustrations that fueled a sensitivity to collective moods and an ease in absorbing narratives of guilt and victimization. This intimate biography does not by itself explain his radicalism, but it does help to understand why simple explanations are insufficient. Hitler learned to interpret his personal failure as part of a collective drama, the supposed decline of Germany and the threat that, according to him, the others represented. In Vienna, a cosmopolitan city but also ideologically volatile in the early 20th century, Hitler absorbed multiple currents. There, pan-Germanism, popular antisemitism, and the pseudo-scientific racial theories that were prevalent throughout much of Europe were all mixed together. Figures like Karl Lueger offered models of demagogic politics. Intellectuals and publicists of the time spread ideas about race, decadence, and the need for national purification. Hitler did not invent those ideas. He internalized them, simplified them, and turned them into a practical program. In his mind, racial categories became all-encompassing explanations. They explained the economy, culture, politics, and morality. Anti-Semitism, thus transformed, ceased to be merely a social prejudice and became the key to interpreting the world. Reading certain texts was crucial. Works by authors who mixed nationalism, social biology, and theories about culture operated as lenses that ordered the perception of Hitler. Among them, the influence of European Völkisch and racist thinkers was decisive. These readings provided Hitler with a theoretical framework. Societies are organisms that require purity. Mixtures are decadence. History is a struggle between races. In his interpretation, history was not a series of complex causes and effects, but a great racial conflict that justified any extreme measure. World War I was another formative factor. Like so many other young Germans, the war gave Hitler a sense of belonging, discipline, and heroism, combat experiences, contact with comrades, and the perception of having been part of a historic mission solidified in him a personal mythology about violence as a legitimate means. But there, too, emerged the narrative of betrayal, the idea that Germany had been deceived, stabbed in the back by socialists and Jews, and deprived of victory. That imaginary conspiracy not only fueled his anti-Semitism, it was the narrative platform that legitimized the politics of revenge and the idea that liberal democracy and left-wing parties were complicit in the national disaster. In the post-war period, the atmosphere of revenge and humiliation stemming from the Treaty of Versailles amplified these convictions. The loss of territory, the economic reparations, and the economic crisis of the Weimar Republic provided tangible material for the policy of mass blame. Hitler knew how to turn popular grievances into a project. He did not simply collect resentment, but organized it into a coherent ideology where enemies were clearly named, the objective was set, and the measures seemed, in his logic, proportionally justified. His ideological synthesis articulated several pieces: an unwavering anti-Semitism that attributed economic and cultural ills to Judaism, a doctrine of life and living space, Lebensraum, that turned territorial expansion into a biological necessity, the belief in racial hierarchy that legitimized domination, and the Führerprinzip, the notion that the nation should be subordinated to the incisive will of a leader who expressed the popular will in its purest form. Each of these elements was not just abstract, it formed the basis for concrete policies. On a psychological level, he combined hatred and ambition, hating imaginary culprits and at the same time aspiring to an empire where his actions would transform history. Hitler used propaganda as an instrument to give substance to his thinking. It did not limit itself to ideological abstractions. It institutionalized mass communication, theatrical speeches, symbols, myths, and rituals that appealed to elemental emotions. The propaganda machine did not only convince, it constructed identities. The idea of a threatened community unified different social groups under one banner and projected Hitler's ambition as the only possible way out. Politics became mass theater, where ideology became a sensory experience: music, marches, flags, and parades. Thus, the abstract materialized theory found flesh, and future violence was presented as the realization of a collective destiny. The pseudo-scientific component was also relevant. Hitler and his collaborators were skilled at giving the appearance of legitimacy to racialist ideas through pseudo-scientific categories. Institutions manipulated statistics, and allied experts presented supposed data on the superiority or inferiority of races, naturalizing discrimination. This technocratic veneer made it possible to justify radical policies to sectors that would otherwise have demanded greater rationality. Scientific rationality became a tool for moral legitimation. If science said that some races were inferior, their elimination or domination could be presented as an act of order and progress. Hitler's personal ambition became intertwined with his political ambition. He was not an ideologue without worldly experience. He was a tactical organizer who knew how to exploit institutional gaps. The radical nature of his thinking was accompanied by an administrative capacity that transformed ideas into state programs. The planning of rearmament, the reorganization of the party, the penetration of spheres of power, the neutralization of the opposition, and the militarization of society showed that his vision was not mere language. He had concrete plans and timelines. That combination made it possible for radical thought to be much more than rhetoric. It became an executable policy. It is also essential to understand how resentment and violence became normalized in their environment. During the Weimar Republic, political violence was relatively widespread. The Freikorps, paramilitary groups, and confrontations between communists and nationalists accustomed sectors of society to the idea of politics as armed struggle. Hitler capitalized on this normalization. His discourse did not seem exceptional to those who already accepted violence as a political tool. Society, fatigued by the crisis, ended up tolerating extraordinary solutions, and this tacit consent allowed its radical ideology to find accelerated application. The notion of urgency was probably the final key that led to the historical acceleration. Hitler did not think in terms of prolonged patience. He believed that history offered limited windows of opportunity that should be seized before international coalitions solidified or before Germany weakened further. This psychology of time transformed an expansionist ideology into a policy of accomplished facts. Action had to be taken quickly and decisively before the European chessboard became immovable. That feeling of racing against the clock is central to understanding why the escalation towards war was not slow. For Hitler, delay meant losing what he saw as the historic opportunity of his generation. Ultimately, it was the intersection between theory and structure that allowed for the rapid implementation of his ideas. His radical thinking found instruments: a disciplined party, the NSDAP, a paramilitary apparatus, a state in the process of militarization, and a bureaucracy willing to turn the leaders' mandates into decrees. The ability to transform an ideological program into action was what made the escalation possible. It was not only the violence of thought that caused the war to erupt so quickly, it was the synchronicity between ideological conviction, organizational structures, and favorable historical conditions. Understanding the construction of Hitler's radical thought therefore involves recognizing multiple vectors: a personal biography marked by resentment, the adoption of racial and nationalist discourses in urban contexts such as Vienna, the humiliating experience of defeat and the interwar crisis, the exploitation of pseudo-scientific currents, the propagandistic systematization that transformed hatred into mass mobilization, and the concrete political ambition that combined vision and planning. Together, these factors not only explain the content of thought, but also its ability to move from the plane of idea to the realm of action with terrifying speed. This intellectual genealogy reveals a disturbing lesson. Radical ideologies do not emerge in a vacuum. They are born when social humiliations, legitimizing theories, and organizational channels converge, and when an individual with charisma and calculation knows how to translate resentment into a power project. In Hitler's case, that combination was lethally effective. It gave his radical thinking the immediacy and practicality that turned the promise of war into a rapidly erupting reality, dragging Europe into total conflict. National trauma and wounded pride, how the Treaty of Versailles shaped their vision. The impact of the Treaty of Versailles on Adolf Hitler's mind was more than a political reaction. It became an emotional, psychological, and ideological pillar that fueled his worldview and guided all his subsequent decisions. For Hitler, Versailles was not simply an agreement imposed at the end of the First World War. It was a collective trauma, a symbol of national humiliation, and, above all, the definitive proof that Germany had been defeated not on the battlefield, but by hidden forces that he reinterpreted through his radical ideology. The treaty opened a wound that, in his thinking, could only be closed with revenge, expansion, and war. The terms of the treaty were perceived in Germany as an unfair imposition. Exorbitant financial reparations, loss of territories, drastic reduction of the army, mandatory demilitarization, industrial prohibitions, and a guilt clause that attributed sole responsibility for the conflict to Germany. Although these measures were not as absolute as Hitler would later present them, for him and many Germans they became symbols of a nation on its knees. The signing of the treaty was interpreted as a forced capitulation that transformed the military defeat, already difficult to accept, into a moral blow that deeply affected national self-esteem. Hitler absorbed this sentiment from the very first moment he became involved in politics. Versailles offered a clear narrative for those seeking simple explanations for complex crises. Inflation, unemployment, social instability, and the institutional degradation of the Weimar Republic seemed to stem directly from the crime of having accepted the treaty. For Hitler, that narrative was more than useful. It was a tool to explain everything. Poverty and economic chaos were attributed to reparations. Social hopelessness was due to forced disarmament. The disintegration of national pride was a consequence of the dictate imposed by the victors. Based on this interpretation, he built a politics of resentment to rekindle pain in order to transform it into mobilization. This process was amplified by the myth of the stab in the back. Many Germans did not accept that the war had been lost militarily. In the trenches, the forces of the German Empire were never completely defeated, and many soldiers returned home with the feeling that something was amiss. Hitler, a war veteran, shared this feeling and turned it into a conviction. Germany, according to him, had been sabotaged from within by socialists, republicans, and, in his distorted view, by the Jews. Versailles then became further proof of this imaginary conspiracy. It was not just an unfair treaty, it was evidence that Germany had been betrayed by its own leaders. On a psychological level, the treaty reinforced Hitler's tendency to interpret the world in terms of hostile forces and external threats. For him, international diplomacy was not an arena for negotiation, but a stage dominated by enemies who sought to weaken Germany indefinitely. The victorious allies of 1918 became powers that sought to keep Germany subjugated to prevent its resurgence. Thus, Hitler developed a paranoid view of the international order. Every diplomatic gesture by the Western powers was a maneuver to prevent Germany from regaining its place in Europe. Wounded pride was central to this transformation. Germany, a country with imperial traditions, a powerful military culture, and a firmly established national identity, suddenly found itself without defensive capabilities, without international prestige, and mired in economic crisis. For Hitler, this humiliation was intolerable. The notion that a superior people, according to his racial ideology, had been subdued by external forces enraged him and convinced him that a natural order had to be restored. That wounded pride became an emotional fuel that would guide his political rhetoric to recover lost dignity, reverse dishonor, and avenge the historical injustice committed against Germany. The economy played a fundamental role in this mental structure. The reparations imposed by the treaty generated decades of instability that Hitler exploited as proof of his thesis. External enemies were suffocating Germany. Although the economic reality was more complex, global crisis, internal failures, contradictory political decisions, Hitler simplified it into a powerful narrative. Germany was impoverished because it had been shackled by Versailles. This message found immediate acceptance among impoverished workers, unemployed veterans, ruined middle-class families, and forgotten rural sectors. Furthermore, the treaty fueled the central idea that would organize all of its foreign policy: the need to break the imposed limits by force. Hitler saw Eastern Europe as vital space for Germany. The loss of territories after the war was interpreted not only as material damage, but as an existential threat. In his view, Germany needed to expand in order to survive. And since Versailles prevented that expansion, the treaty became, in their logic, an obstacle that had to be destroyed through direct confrontation. Hitler's relationship with the treaty also shaped his perception of historical time. His idea of acting quickly, of not waiting too long, was formed in part by the urgency of reversing Versailles before its effects became irreversible. He believed that Germany had a limited window of opportunity. If it did not act soon, the country would be trapped in a cycle of permanent decline. This sense of last chance gave a particular speed to his foreign policy and largely explains why the war began so quickly once Hitler consolidated his power. The treaty had not only humiliated Germany. In its interpretation, it had set the nation's fate on a countdown. Even his vision of leadership was shaped by Versailles. Hitler concluded that only a strong, authoritarian, and decisive leader could reverse an injustice of that magnitude. Democracy, associated with the Weimar peace negotiators, was for him a form of weakness. In contrast, the figure of the Führer emerged as an antidote, the leader capable of doing what the traitorous politicians did not do. His conviction of absolute leadership, one of the foundations of Nazi totalitarianism, was consolidated in response to what he saw as the German institutional failure during the post-war negotiations. Over time, this narrative became an essential part of the regime's political and social education. From schools to public events, Versailles was presented as the foundational humiliation of the new German millennium. It was taught that Germany had been robbed, that its people had been deceived, and that only through radical action could order be restored. This pedagogy of resentment reinforced, generation after generation, the link between national trauma and the political project of Nazism. Ultimately, the Treaty of Versailles not only influenced Hitler's vision, it became the emotional and symbolic foundation of his ideology. He transformed resentment into a project, wounded pride into a justification for violence, paranoia into a strategy, and the desire for revenge into a state program. For Hitler, Versailles was the wound that had to be repaired through war, and that conviction would shape every step that led Europe to the most devastating conflict in history. War as a solution. Why Hitler saw conflict as a historical necessity. Hitler's relationship with time was one of the most decisive psychological elements in understanding the speed with which the world was dragged into World War II. For him, history was not a slow and gradual process, but a succession of opportunities that appeared and disappeared rapidly. This perception created a permanent sense of urgency that shaped every one of his strategic decisions. Hitler did not conceive of foreign policy as a patient construction, but as a race against time. And that feeling, that inner impulse to act before being fully prepared, was central to explaining why Germany headed for war with almost suicidal speed. Hitler believed that Germany was trapped in a kind of narrow corridor. On one side, the country was still weak after World War I. On the other side, the powers that had won the war were reorganizing. He knew that if he waited too long, France and the United Kingdom might coordinate, the Soviet Union would strengthen its military apparatus, and the United States would increase its global influence. From his point of view, the international balance, still unstable in the 1930s, represented a unique opportunity that had to be seized before Germany's enemies consolidated alliances and fortified their borders. This conception of time was intensified by his deeply competitive view of the world. Hitler did not see international politics as a space for negotiation or balance, but as a permanent chessboard of struggle, where each nation competed for resources, territory, and influence. In his ideological interpretation, nations that hesitated were doomed. Those that waited too long were devoured by more determined rivals. For him, the countries that triumphed were not the most diplomatic, but the most daring, and that audacity had to be expressed in swift and decisive actions that would leave the enemies without the ability to react. For Hitler, the advance of German rearmament was a race between capability and risk. Germany, when he came to power, was not prepared for a large-scale conflict. However, its industrial and military growth was progressing at an astonishing pace thanks to economic reorganization, the expansion of arms production, and the total mobilization of resources. But Hitler sensed that this growth had limits. He feared that if he took too long to act, Western democracies would end up imposing a new series of sanctions or blockades that would paralyze the German economy. He also suspected that in time the internal opposition, albeit weakened, could reorganize and challenge his expansionist projects. In his understanding, waiting was giving his enemies time to strengthen themselves. The obsession with acting before being surrounded was clearly reflected in his vision of living space in Eastern Europe. Hitler saw that territory as the key to Germany's long-term survival. In a world where Western colonial empires already controlled vast portions of the planet, he imagined that if Germany did not expand soon, it would be trapped within its current borders forever, dependent on foreign resources and vulnerable to any international coalition. His theory of Lebensraum was, above all, a theory of time. It was necessary to seize those territories while it was still possible to do so with relative ease. For Hitler, if Germany did not conquer the East at that specific moment in history, it would never be able to do so. Domestic politics also fueled his sense of urgency. Hitler knew that his legitimacy depended on success. The German economy was driven by constant mobilization, construction, militarization, infrastructure projects, expansion of industries. But this machinery depended on political and territorial conquests that justified the enormous expenses. If the regime did not deliver visible victories, social enthusiasm could begin to fade. Therefore, speed was not just a military strategy. It was a mechanism to maintain internal cohesion and demonstrate that his leadership was fulfilling its promise of national restoration. Speed became a symbol of power. Hitler also feared that German youth, whom he considered the fundamental human material for war, would change over time. I thought there was a generation especially shaped by the frustration of the post-war period, tough, disciplined young people willing to sacrifice themselves. But he sensed that as the years went by, this generation would be replaced by a more comfortable one, raised in a partially stabilized country. According to him, the war should be waged while that specific generation was of fighting age. It was a demographic window that he considered unrepeatable. His obsession with preventing Western powers from rearming was also decisive. Hitler was aware of the military limitations of France and the United Kingdom in the 1930s. He knew that pacifism, the fear of another conflict and political divisions, weakened his governments. Meanwhile, the German economy, although under pressure, had recovered more quickly than the Western economies. Waiting 5 or 10 years meant allowing their rivals to regain the strength they had lost during the economic depression. In his mind, Germany was momentarily ahead of its enemies in terms of will, national energy, and ideological preparedness. That momentum had to be seized before the rest of the world realized the danger and formed a united front. Another crucial element was his interpretation of Soviet times. Hitler viewed the Soviet Union as his main strategic enemy, but also as an adversary that was still going through complicated internal processes: political purges, military reorganization, and rapid industrialization. He was convinced that the Soviets would be much more dangerous in the following decade. Therefore, his strategy was to attack when he still considered the USSR relatively weak. And ironically, this same perception, half right and half wrong, is what most precipitated the decisions that ended up leading to the world conflict. The obsession with time was also expressed in his distrust of diplomatic rhythms. Hitler was frustrated by the slowness of negotiations, international congresses, and multilateral agreements. He believed that traditional diplomacy was a mechanism for delaying action and keeping Germany under control. Therefore, whenever he was presented with a diplomatic success, such as the remilitarization of the Rhineland, he interpreted it as a sign that swift action was more effective than waiting. The passivity of the Western powers reinforced his view that time was on his side, provided he acted boldly enough. Finally, his own psychology contributed crucially to this obsession. Hitler lived with a mixture of fatalism and personal mission. He believed that history had placed him at a critical point and that he had to act before that historical force disappeared. He considered his leadership an unrepeatable phenomenon. If he did not carry out his expansionist policy at that stage of his life, no one else would. His thinking was imbued with an almost mystical sense of urgency. It was now or never. Taken together, this temporal perspective explains the speed with which it moved towards war. The combination of factors, economic, military, ideological, geopolitical, and psychological, came together into one fixed idea. Germany had to attack before the world could stop it. This logic shaped their strategy and turned what could have been a gradual process into a series of accelerated decisions that left the continent with no time to react. Hitler not only believed that history had a window for Germany, I thought that window was about to close, and his conviction to act before being surrounded pushed Europe into conflict faster than many leaders of the time could have imagined. A war provoked not only by tanks and armies, but by an obsessive and distorted perception of time. The strategic deception, the manipulation of Europe while preparing the attack. From Hitler's rise to power, European diplomacy became a chessboard where every gesture, every speech, and every treaty formed part of an elaborate choreography whose main objective was to hide Germany's true ambition. Hitler understood that Germany was not yet ready for a direct confrontation, but he also knew that political speed was his best weapon. Their strategy consisted not only of secretly rearming, but also of creating the illusion that Germany was seeking stability, cooperation, and peaceful restoration, while internally preparing to unleash a war that would completely change the map of Europe. The deception began from within. Hitler constructed an ambiguous public image in which he mixed aggressive speeches about the injustice of the Treaty of Versailles with seemingly moderate statements about his desire to reintegrate Germany into the international community. This duality confused foreign political observers and journalists. Hitler knew that Western democracies were morally exhausted after World War I and deeply feared any sign of conflict. He took advantage of that fear to present himself as a leader who, although vehement, was negotiable. Ambiguity was his weapon. Meanwhile, he carefully designed German foreign policy to make it appear as if the country was merely claiming basic rights or correcting humiliations. Thus, every aggressive move had a diplomatic disguise. The withdrawal from the League of Nations was justified as a rejection of military discrimination. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was sold as a defensive action on German territory. The annexation of Austria was presented as a voluntary union between brother peoples. Every military action was wrapped in a narrative of rectification or reunification, an emotional discourse that neutralized international critics and disarmed the Allied reaction. One of the pillars of the strategic deception was the calculated use of negotiations. Hitler was aware that democratic leaders, especially in France and the United Kingdom, were inclined towards appeasement. He knew they feared a new conflict and that they would prioritize any diplomatic avenue over an immediate confrontation. Therefore, whenever Europe was alarmed by a German action, Hitler responded with a mixture of feigned calm and negotiable proposals. He put partial solutions on the table, assured that he had no further territorial demands, and showed himself open to treaties that he would later violate without hesitation. In the years leading up to the war, Hitler became a master of psychological manipulation. He detected his adversaries' insecurities and exploited their moral weakness. He knew that France was politically fractured and that its government was afraid to act without British support. He knew that the United Kingdom was distracted by its empire, tied down by an economic crisis, and dominated by pacifist voices that preferred to give in rather than fight. He understood the internal movements of his opponents with surprising clarity and took advantage of every hesitation to advance one step further, always under the appearance of being ready to stop. The deception was also internal to the regime. Hitler prevented even important figures in his government from understanding the full magnitude of his plans. He gave partial instructions, kept military secrets in the hands of a few, and used his charismatic authority to ensure unquestioning obedience. This internal opacity served to prevent leaks and ensure that Germany moved towards war without the state machinery knowing exactly when and how it would happen. He thus created a system where uncertainty was an instrument of control. Diplomatic manipulation was strongly expressed in policy towards Eastern Europe. Hitler encouraged the countries of the region to believe that Germany would respect their borders if they cooperated politically or economically with the Reich. He promised them protection from external threats, especially the Soviet Union, while secretly planning his future invasion. It played on the historical fears of the Eastern European countries, exploiting rivalries between them and fostering the idea that Germany was a stable and predictable counterweight. In reality, every country that approached Berlin diplomatically became an easier target for territorial expansion. One of the most audacious deceptions was the handling of the Czechoslovak case. Hitler knew that the ethnic tension in the Sudetenland could become a perfect excuse to dismember the country without firing a shot. While intensifying propaganda campaigns about the oppression of ethnic Germans, he sent contradictory signals to London and Paris. On the one hand, he demanded annexation. On the other, he claimed it was his last territorial demand in Europe. This outright lie, the promise that after the Sudetenland there would be no more demands, was accepted by European rulers, desperate to avoid war. And so in Munich, Hitler achieved a monumental diplomatic victory, which not only handed over the Sudetenland, but also convinced the world that it was possible to appease him. Hitler's true skill lay in turning his own treaty violations into political opportunities. Every time Germany broke an international agreement, other countries hesitated between reacting militarily or seeking rational explanations for not doing so. Hitler was aware of this dilemma and exploited it perfectly. He knew that British and French public opinion would oppose the war if German action seemed reasonable or limited. Therefore, each violation was accompanied by a narrative that justified the act as a minimal correction, a logical, even moral movement. At the same time, internal propaganda led the German people to believe that the Western powers were weak, indecisive, and decadent. This perception fueled Hitler's confidence that as long as he maintained the accelerated pace of his diplomatic and military advances, the enemies would not have time to coordinate a response. The speed of the deception was crucial. Each political conquest had to precede the next before Europe could fully grasp the magnitude of the danger. The pact with the Soviet Union was perhaps the most brilliant and baffling moment of manipulation in the entire Hitlerian strategy. For years, Hitler had presented communism as the mortal enemy of Germany. Suddenly, he signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin, surprising all of Europe. This agreement led the British and French to believe that Hitler was seeking stability in the East and that he might still be contained through diplomacy. Meanwhile, in reality, the pact was merely a temporary instrument that guaranteed him the freedom to start the war against Poland without fearing an Eastern front. It was a deception of such magnitude that even within the Nazi Party itself there was bewilderment, but Hitler knew that it offered him a crucial geopolitical advantage. This entire network of manipulations had one central objective: to buy time, time to reassemble, time to intimidate your neighbors, time to sow doubt in democracies, time to prepare the Wehrmacht, time for Europe to lower its guard. And so, when he finally decided to attack Poland, he did so at a time when Europeans were divided, confused, and weakened by years of deception. Even then, many foreign leaders did not believe that the invasion would start an all-out war. Hitler's strategic deception worked because he exploited the psychology of his adversaries, the structural weaknesses of their governments, and the collective trauma of a past war. It was a massive, calculated, and cold-blooded manipulation operation designed to allow Germany to prepare for a conflict that, paradoxically, its victims were still trying to avoid. Europe was not dragged into war solely by the strength of the German army, but by a chain of carefully constructed lies. Lies that became policies, policies that were transformed into concessions, and concessions that paved the way for catastrophe. Hitler not only prepared the attack, he prepared the perception, shaped the fear, manipulated the hope, and created a diplomatic mirage that kept Europe immobile until it was too late. The acceleration of rearmament, the clandestine plan to rebuild an army in record time. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, Germany was bound by the severe military restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. The country was prohibited from possessing tanks, military aircraft, submarines, and a ground force exceeding 100,000 men. In theory, Germany was supposed to remain disarmed, unable to start a conflict. In practice, this scenario was precisely the justification Hitler needed to launch one of the most ambitious, risky, and secret projects in all of modern military history: to rebuild an army capable of conquering Europe, and to do so in less than a decade. Hitler, obsessed with the idea of military supremacy, understood that the transformation of the Reich depended on a single crucial variable: time. He knew that the European powers, if they clearly perceived the magnitude of his plans, would act swiftly to stop him. That is why it needed to rearm itself in silence, in the shadows, deceiving diplomats, flouting international treaties, and reorganizing the national economy for a future war, while the world believed that Germany was still weakened. The key to success would always be speed. The first step in the clandestine rearmament was to hide the real military structure under civilian organizations. Flight schools, for example, were presented as sports clubs, where young Germans supposedly learned recreational aviation. In reality, it was the seed of a future Luftwaffe, training military pilots under the guise of civilian activities. The same thing happened with armored vehicles. Factories that officially produced tractors or agricultural machinery were designing prototypes of light tanks, studying armor, and developing engines that would soon be used in panzer divisions. The regime also took advantage of secret agreements with nations that no one would have imagined as partners of the new German militarism. One of the most surprising was the cooperation with the Soviet Union during the 1920s and early 1930s. In Soviet territory, far from European eyes, German officers trained with weapons banned by Versailles: tanks, heavy artillery, poison gas, and aircraft. This clandestine training meant that once Hitler took power, there was already a generation of fighters and technicians prepared to rapidly expand the armed forces. Hitler transformed the German economy into a war machine through total industrial mobilization. Public works policy, such as the construction of highways or Autobahnen, was not just propaganda to demonstrate economic growth. In reality, it had a calculated military objective: to create an infrastructure that would allow troops and armored vehicles to be moved at high speed throughout the country, something essential for the future Blitzkrieg. Every road built in the preceding years was, secretly, a strategic corridor for future invasions. State control over the industry was absolute. Private companies such as Krupp, IG Farben, Rheinmetall, and Messerschmitt became pillars of a frenetic military production program. To ensure this transformation, the regime created a parallel financial system that concealed the true magnitude of the spending. One of the most important instruments was the issuance of MAFO bills, secret financial certificates that allowed the rearmament to be financed without appearing in the official budgets. These documents, designed by Hjalmar Schacht, were a kind of hidden promissory note whose sole purpose was to inflate the military economy without raising international suspicions. Thanks to this mechanism, Germany spent billions on weapons while European democracies believed it was simply recovering. The clandestine nature of the operation also reached the structure of the army. Hitler began to increase the number of soldiers through paramilitary organizations disguised as cultural or sporting associations. The Hitler Youth and the Sturmabteilung, SA, functioned as breeding grounds to train millions of young people in discipline, basic weapons handling, and ideological indoctrination. Although officially not part of the army, these organizations ensured that, when the order to expand came, there would be a huge human reserve ready to integrate into the new divisions. In 1935, Hitler played one of his boldest cards. He publicly announced mandatory military service and the existence of the Luftwaffe, openly violating the Treaty of Versailles. What was surprising was not the challenge, but the global reaction. France and the United Kingdom protested but did not act. Hitler then realized that he could accelerate rearmament without fear of an immediate response. This moment was a turning point. If before the rearmament was clandestine, from then on it became a frenetic and almost open race. The industry expanded at a rate that seemed impossible. From having no tanks in 1933, Germany produced thousands in just 4 years. The Luftwaffe transformed itself into one of the most powerful air forces in Europe in record time. The army went from 100,000 poorly equipped men to millions of soldiers trained under a modern doctrine focused on rapid movement warfare and coordination between air and ground. Another essential component was standardization and efficiency in production processes. Germany eliminated unnecessary models, reduced the variety of weapons, and concentrated resources on reliable, easy-to-repair, and quick-to-manufacture equipment. This pragmatic approach proved ideal for a Blitzkrieg. Every tank, every aircraft, every truck could be produced and repaired quickly, guaranteeing an operational pace unmatched by other powers in the early years of the conflict. Hitler also used diplomacy as a tool for accelerated rearmament. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 marked a decisive step. Moving troops into the demilitarized territory was risky, but Hitler knew that if the Western powers did not react, Germany would gain a crucial strategic position. Not only was his calculation correct, he also demonstrated to the Wehrmacht that audacity would be tolerated internationally. This strengthened the morale of the army and fueled the idea that Germany could act without fear. Each diplomatic victory, Austria, the Sudetenland, Munich, not only expanded German territory, it multiplied its military resources. New factories, new labor reserves, new strategic routes, and above all, a growing prestige that convinced even skeptics within the regime that rearmament should be accelerated even further. By the end of the 1930s, Germany was no longer the disarmed country of 1933. It was a gigantic military power, with an economy entirely geared towards war, an industry perfectly synchronized with the needs of the army, and a command structure designed to act quickly. What seemed to the rest of Europe like a surprising phenomenon, the German military resurgence in such a short time, was in reality the product of meticulous planning, sustained diplomatic deception, and a total mobilization of human and material resources. Hitler had achieved in 6 years what other countries would take decades to build. He had rebuilt a modern, fearsome army, ready for the offensive, and what's most disturbing is that he did it while the world watched, without really understanding what was happening. By the time the Western powers grasped the magnitude of German rearmament, the military machinery was already in motion. Germany not only had an army, it had a plan, a military doctrine, and a strategic machine designed to attack without giving anyone time to react. The acceleration of rearmament was not just a military operation. It was a political, economic, psychological, and propaganda operation planned with surgical precision. The rapid resurgence of German power set the stage for a war that could not have started so soon, if it had not been for this monumental, clandestine, and extraordinarily effective deployment. When Hitler considered his army ready, diplomacy ceased to be useful, and the world, which had ignored the warning for years, discovered too late that the German rearmament had not been a defensive move, but the prelude to an unprecedented conquest. Unresistant expansion, how early diplomatic victories reinforced their hurry. From the early years of his rule, Hitler understood that foreign policy could be as powerful an instrument as the army. The initial diplomatic victories not only expanded Germany's influence, but also reinforced the Führer's personal perception that he could act swiftly before the European powers reacted. Every agreement, every annexation, and every concession obtained without military confrontation became tangible evidence that haste was not only necessary, but also effective. The first big lesson came with the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936. The Treaty of Versailles had demilitarized this region, turning it into an unprotected border zone. Hitler decided to openly violate this provision by sending German troops into the area. The surprise was the absence of an immediate military reaction from France or the United Kingdom. Hitler interpreted the passivity of Western democracies as implicit permission. Acting before a coordinated response was not only possible, but advantageous. This success reinforced the idea that diplomacy and calculated threats could temporarily replace armed conflict, accelerating the execution of their territorial ambitions. The annexation of Austria, the so-called Anschluss, in 1938 was another example of this strategy. Hitler took advantage of the sympathy of pro-German Austrian sectors, fostered internal pressure, and used a symbolic military deployment to intimidate without provoking combat. The absence of significant opposition from the international community reinforced the conviction that Germany could absorb territories through psychological and diplomatic maneuvers before the democracies could react. Each conquest not only added territory, but also strengthened their perception of impunity and the need to act quickly. The case of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia definitively consolidated this strategy. Hitler exploited ethnic tensions, fostered propaganda, and presented his demands as just historical corrections. France and the United Kingdom, fearing a conflict, accepted mediation, and finally the Munich Agreement in September 1938 ceded the Sudetenland to Germany without firing a single shot. This victory was psychologically crucial. It showed Hitler that he could force international concessions through calculated pressure and strategic threat, reinforcing the feeling that patience was not necessary, but that acting quickly multiplied the results. Haste became a tool. The sooner he moved his pieces, the greater the rewards. These initial victories had a feedback effect on the Reich's internal strategy. The military leadership, bureaucrats and Nazi party leaders observed that quick and bold maneuvers produced tangible results. The regime's morale rose and internal cohesion was consolidated. Internal propaganda turned these actions into symbols of effectiveness and authority, reinforcing the perception that Germany was regaining its place in Europe. For Hitler, diplomacy was not an end in itself. It was a means to buy time, secure resources, and prepare the country for open war. Moreover, each diplomatic success increased Hitler's confidence in his own judgment and in the vulnerability of his adversaries. He began to perceive that Western democracies, trapped in internal debates and fear of repeating the experience of the First World War, lacked the capacity for a rapid response. This prompted him to accelerate his agenda. If passivity persisted, it was imperative to take advantage of it before any political or military change altered the balance. International pressure, in effect, became a catalyst for the rush. Hitler understood that his window of opportunity was limited. Any sign of a strong reaction from France, the United Kingdom, or even Italy could slow the pace of expansion. Therefore, at every step, he sought to combine diplomatic astuteness with implicit military pressure. A symbolic deployment of troops, veiled threats, or intense propaganda functioned as tools of intimidation without the need for combat, ensuring that each advance occurred before an effective coalition against Germany could be formed. The accumulation of these early victories strengthened the calculated risk strategy. Hitler began operating under the conviction that diplomacy could be manipulated to produce immediate results and that Western democracies would give in rather than react. This approach allowed German expansion to proceed quickly and without the direct opposition that would normally have slowed down a process of rearmament or territorial annexation. The lesson was clear. Time was on their side if they acted with boldness and determination. Finally, the feeling of early success reinforced the military acceleration cycle itself. Each added territory provided resources, industry, and personnel that could be incorporated into rearmament and preparation for future conflicts. The combination of diplomatic gains and territorial expansion increased the capacity for immediate action, confirming Hitler's perception that every delay would be a risk. Haste ceased to be a secondary strategic choice and became a guiding principle. Speed was the key to maximizing opportunities and maintaining an advantage over adversaries. In conclusion, the early diplomatic victories not only expanded Germany without resistance, they also solidified Hitler's philosophy of acting quickly. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, the Anschluss, and the absorption of the Sudetenland demonstrated that the combination of threat, propaganda, and manipulation could bear fruit before rivals had time to react. Each success reinforced the sense of urgency and the obsession with anticipating any eventuality, accelerating the path to total war and turning strategic haste into a central trait of the Führer. The pact with Stalin, the psychological blunder that opened the way to Poland. In August 1939, Europe watched with tension as Germany and the Soviet Union signed an agreement that seemed to defy all political logic, the German-Soviet non-aggression pact known as the Hitler-Stalin Pact. For many, it was a monumental surprise. Hitler, who had presented Soviet communism as a mortal enemy for years, had managed to negotiate a compromise with Stalin that neutralized the Eastern threat and opened a free path to Poland. This pact was not just a treaty, it was a psychological and strategic maneuver of extraordinary magnitude, designed to ensure Germany's freedom of action and accelerate the outbreak of war under favorable conditions. From the German perspective, the pact solved a critical problem. Hitler knew that Poland was protected by diplomatic guarantees from France and the United Kingdom, and that any premature attack without neutralizing the risk from the east could ignite a two-front conflict. The Soviet Union, located east of Poland, represented the greatest potential threat for a rapid invasion. By negotiating with Stalin, Hitler secured a strategic neutrality that would eliminate the possibility of the Soviet army interfering in his initial offensive. Moreover, the diplomatic rhetoric used to present the pact to Europe was carefully calibrated. Peace and cooperation between the two countries were emphasized, while the secret terms, the division of Poland and Soviet influence in the Baltic, remained hidden. The psychological effect of this pact on Western Europe was immediate. France and the United Kingdom, aware of the German threat but trusting in apparent Soviet neutrality, were momentarily paralyzed. Hitler perfectly understood the dynamic. If the Western powers perceived Germany as isolated, they could respond more quickly. If, on the other hand, they saw that Germany and the Soviet Union maintained a facade of understanding, their reactions would be more cautious. The treaty became a tool of strategic manipulation. It gave the impression of stability while preparing the ground for aggression. Internally, the pact consolidated the feeling of operational freedom within the Reich. Hitler was no longer limited by the possibility of a simultaneous conflict on two fronts, which allowed him to accelerate preparations for the invasion of Poland. The Wehrmacht could concentrate on planning quick and coordinated offensives. The Luftwaffe could reorganize its forces to ensure immediate air superiority, and logistical plans could be optimized without fear of Soviet interference. The agreement provided a strategic margin that transformed the invasion of Poland into a carefully calculated operation, with minimized risk and maximum certainty of initial success. The pact also had a direct political effect on German diplomacy. Hitler used it as an instrument of indirect intimidation. While Western leaders debated how to react, Hitler was rapidly advancing military preparations and propaganda. Each step reinforced the perception that Germany was in control of the situation, that aggression was inevitable, and that any delay by the adversaries would only benefit Berlin. This combination of secret action and public manipulation amplified the psychological effect of the treaty. Europe was trapped in an illusion of peace, while Germany secured its strategic advantage. Furthermore, the pact allowed Hitler to exploit the historical rivalry between Poland and the Soviet Union. The existence of a secret territorial division agreement increased the pressure on Warsaw, weakening its room for maneuver and creating uncertainty about joint defense with France and the United Kingdom. Hitler knew that this manipulation weakened Polish resistance even before the fighting began. In this case, diplomacy was an extension of military strategy, a psychological attack that paved the way for a swift and devastating invasion. In practice, the pact resulted in a tacit coordination between both totalitarian regimes. Germany would advance from the west and north, while the Soviet Union, in the event of intervention, would occupy the eastern part of Poland according to secret terms. This foresight allowed Hitler to concentrate his resources and plan the Blitzkrieg without worrying about an active eastern front, optimizing logistics, troop transport, and the mobilization of tanks and heavy artillery. German military efficiency in the September 1939 invasion was largely a product of this strategic freedom granted to them by the pact. The psychological maneuvering behind the treaty also extended to the international arena. Hitler understood that the surprise and apparent contradiction between his anti-communist discourse and the signing of the pact generated confusion in European governments. This confusion delayed critical decisions, weakened the will to act, and gave Germany an additional advantage: time to consolidate positions, advance rapidly, and create fate's accomplice that would be difficult to reverse. Ultimately, the Hitler-Stalin Pact was not a mere diplomatic agreement. It was a carefully calculated strategic instrument that cleared the way to Poland, provided military security, manipulated Europe, and reinforced the perception of urgency and opportunity that characterized the Führer's policy. By guaranteeing Soviet neutrality, Hitler created the perfect condition to launch his initial offensive without fear of a two-front conflict, thus accelerating the start of World War II and demonstrating once again the lethal combination of military audacity and psychological manipulation that defined his strategic style. Confidence in Blitzkrieg, the belief in Blitzkrieg as an irresistible weapon. From his early years in power, Adolf Hitler understood that speed would be one of the fundamental keys to his military strategy. His vision of war was not limited to the mass mobilization of troops, but incorporated a revolutionary concept in Europe: the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This doctrine did not arise from nothing. It was a combination of experiences from the First World War, studies of modern tactics, technological advances, and a deep personal conviction that war should be brief, decisive, and overwhelming. For Hitler, Blitzkrieg was not simply a tactical tool. It was an ideological principle that reinforced his philosophy of swift, bold, and decisive action, in which speed and surprise could replace mere numerical strength. The Blitzkrieg represented, above all, a way to break the resistance of the enemies before they had the opportunity to organize themselves. Hitler had observed the long, static trench battles of World War I and concluded that slowness, indecisiveness, and prolonged warfare were disastrous for Germany. The traumatic experience of 1914 to 1918 reinforced his desire to develop a method that would avoid a war of attrition and guarantee a quick victory by coordinating tanks, aircraft, and artillery in a comprehensive combined attack system. In his mind, the Blitzkrieg had to be irresistible, a military hurricane that would break the will of the adversary before he could react. The concept was not purely theoretical. Hitler and his generals worked on the logistical preparations for the Blitzkrieg for years, integrating accelerated rearmament with meticulous military exercises. The doctrine relied on three fundamental pillars: speed, coordination, and surprise. The mobility of the panzer divisions allowed them to quickly penetrate enemy lines, while the Luftwaffe provided air superiority, precise bombing, and direct tactical support. The artillery and infantry followed closely behind, consolidating positions and ensuring that the armored advance was not isolated. Each component of the army had to function as part of a single system, where speed of decision-making and immediate action were more important than the mere number of men or weapons. Hitler's confidence in this doctrine was fueled by a twofold psychological effect. On the one hand, their perception of time as a critical factor reinforced the need for lightning attacks. The sooner they acted, the less the enemy powers would have to regroup or form alliances. On the other hand, the Blitzkrieg perfectly suited his belief that war should serve not only military but also political ends. Quick victories boosted internal morale, consolidated his authority, and deterred enemies through a devastating effect of shock and surprise. Each quick victory was, in their logic, proof of German superiority and validation of their strategic vision. Trials and initial implementations of this tactic confirmed its effectiveness. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 showed how the combination of tanks, aircraft, and coordinated ground forces could produce extraordinarily rapid results. The Wehrmacht penetrated deep into Polish territory in a matter of days, breaking through defenses previously considered strong and forcing the enemy to retreat rapidly. Hitler interpreted this success not only as a military victory, but as validation of his belief in the strategic superiority of the Blitzkrieg. The speed of the campaign made the occupation a relatively controlled process and reduced Germany's exposure to protracted conflicts that could have depleted its resources. The implementation of the Blitzkrieg in the West further consolidated this confidence. The invasion of France in 1940 was conceived as an operation where mobility and surprise replaced the numerical superiority possessed by the Allies. The fall of the Netherlands and Belgium, followed by the encirclement of France through the Ardennes, showed that speed and audacity could overcome geographical and defensive barriers that military experts considered impossible to overcome. For Hitler, these early victories reinforced the idea that timing and swift action were more decisive than mere prolonged planning or waiting for a perfect opportunity. Each successful operation reinforced the conviction that the Blitzkrieg was an almost invincible weapon. Confidence in the Blitzkrieg was also reflected in the mental and moral preparation of the troops. Hitler understood that the element of surprise and speed not only weakened the enemy, but also created a devastating psychological effect, demoralized enemy units, insecure political leaders, and a terrified civilian population. The Blitzkrieg not only destroyed physical defenses, it broke wills and generated chaos, increasing the efficiency of attacks and reducing organized resistance. This psychological effect reinforced the perception that German doctrine was superior in every way. However, blind faith in Blitzkrieg also contained implicit risks. The reliance on speed meant that any logistical failure, supply delay, or unexpected reaction could turn an offensive into a disaster. Even so, Hitler was convinced that audacity and speed could compensate for any vulnerability. His military philosophy prioritized personal initiative, immediate decision-making, and the exploitation of enemy weaknesses before they could become entrenched. The Blitzkrieg became the embodiment of his vision: act first, act fast, and act decisively. The doctrine was also complemented by propaganda. Each lightning success was presented as proof of German superiority and the inevitability of its expansion. The internal and external narrative reinforced the idea that the Blitzkrieg was an unstoppable force, creating a cycle of mutual trust. Victories generated more conviction, conviction fueled more audacity, and audacity produced new victories. Hitler saw in this cycle a tool that extended military effectiveness beyond the pure physical capacity of his troops. Finally, the belief in Blitzkrieg transcended tactics and became a guiding principle of German policy. The war had to be swift, decisive, and total. Each campaign was designed not only to defeat the enemy, but to create an impression of strategic inevitability, ensuring that speed and surprise dominated both the terrain and international perception. Hitler not only relied on Blitzkrieg as a military tactic, he considered it a weapon of psychological, political, and strategic engineering, capable of reshaping Europe before his adversaries could react. The final decision. The moment Hitler concluded that the world would not react in time, Hitler's rise to power and the transformation of Germany would not have had such immediate consequences without a central psychological element, the almost obsessive certainty that the world would not act in time to stop him. This conviction did not arise from chance nor from simple arrogance. It was the result of years of observation, calculation, and strategic experimentation. Hitler analyzed every international response to his actions, measured the slowness of Western democracies, and assessed the political and social divisions of his rivals. With each step Germany took, from the remilitarization of the Rhineland to the annexation of Austria and the absorption of the Sudetenland, the evidence seemed to confirm that the inaction of the European powers was not an accident, but a structural constant. No one would react quickly enough to prevent its objectives. The moment when this conviction was consolidated was progressive and cumulative. It was not an isolated moment, but a chain of political and diplomatic signals that reinforced their perception of impunity. Every international negotiation that granted him concessions without war, every hesitation by France or the United Kingdom, every silence in the face of flagrant violations of treaties, built the certainty that he could act boldly. Hitler closely observed the speeches of foreign leaders, their parliamentary vacillations, and the pressure of pacifist public opinion. Every delay, every attempt at mediation, and every concession granted to Germany was interpreted as confirmation that the world simply would not react in time to curb its expansion. This perception culminated in the pact with Stalin. By securing Soviet neutrality, Hitler eliminated at a stroke the risk of a two-front conflict, which had historically been the greatest threat to Germany. The signing of the agreement reinforced his belief that Poland could be attacked without immediate interference from the East, while Western democracies would continue to hesitate in the face of aggression. This treaty not only had strategic value in military terms, it was the definitive psychological evidence that the inaction of other international actors gave it almost absolute room to maneuver. The sense of opportunity was now tangible and quantifiable. He could move forward, and the world wouldn't react quickly enough to stop him. Hitler also relied on his interpretation of time and history. He believed that Germany had historically been harmed by waiting too long, and that speed was a decisive factor for survival and national prestige. This temporal conception, combined with the observation of European behavior, allowed him to conclude that any delay would jeopardize the strategic initiative. The perception of urgency merged with the certainty of impunity. If he acted quickly, he would maximize territorial and political gains. If he hesitated, he would lose the advantage before the army and the economy were fully prepared. Internal experience reinforced his decision. The Blitzkrieg had shown extraordinary results in initial exercises and campaigns. Each early victory reinforced the conviction that Germany could not only act quickly, but that its speed and audacity were more decisive than mere numerical strength or enemy preparedness. The lightning victories in Poland and then in France proved that the concept worked in practice, validating the theory that acting before the world reacted was not only possible, but essential for military and political success. Hitler also perceived the ineffectiveness of European alliances as a factor that confirmed his decision. The political fragmentation in France, the internal debates in the United Kingdom, and the lack of coordination between the two countries demonstrated that Western leaders lacked the capacity for immediate response. Even the threat of international retaliation was seen by him as controllable. Economic sanctions would take time to take effect, diplomatic fronts would be slow, and any military action would face poor coordination from allies. All this reinforced the idea that Germany could act first with a strategic and moral advantage, and that the world's reaction would be too slow to stop it. On a psychological level, Hitler became convinced that history had placed him at a critical point. Strong leadership, a rearmed Germany, and a divided international community were unique conditions that would not be repeated. This perception reinforced his drive to decide without delay. The temporary opportunity was ephemeral and had to be seized immediately. The combination of military preparedness, the weakness of adversaries, and diplomatic astuteness formed the basis of their final calculation. War could begin, and Germany could control the narrative of events before others could coordinate an effective response. Ultimately, the decision to act was not only strategic but also psychological. Hitler understood that success depended on initiative, the ability to impose fates accomplis, and speed in execution. In his analysis, the world was trapped in indecision and bureaucracy. Any late move would give Germany an advantage, while passivity would allow it to create a momentum that would be impossible to reverse. With this certainty, Hitler concluded that the moment had arrived. The inaction of the world offered him the freedom to move his pieces and unleash the war before anyone could stop him. In conclusion, the decisive moment in Hitler's mind was not an isolated event, but the culmination of years of observation, manipulation, military rehearsal, and analysis of European behavior. The combination of diplomatic victories, accelerated rearmament, strategic pacts, and the perception of slowness from adversaries allowed him to assume with absolute conviction that he could act first. World War II did not begin by accident. It began because Hitler was convinced, with calculated precision, that the world would not react in time to stop him, and that conviction became the driving force behind his final decision.